We're talking today with Cathy Seifert of Kapolei, Hawaii. And you served as an officer in the U.S. Navy for about 20 years here. So why don't we begin sort of at the beginning? Where were you born and when?
I was born in well, that's not true. You know, my mother would despair of this, but I can never remember whether I was born in St. Mary's or Blodgett in Grand Rapids.
So Grand Rapids, Michigan then.
December 1952.
Okay. And what did your family do?
My father was in the Army, actually. My mom was a typical 50s stay-at-home wife, at least for about the first 7 or 8 years of my life.
Okay. Now, did your family move around a lot because your father was in the Army? Or?
When I was small, we lived, that I can remember when I was small, we lived in Indiana at Fort Benjamin Harrison for a while. One of my brothers was born there. And we lived in Germany. The other brother, the one that's next to me in age, was born in Germany. But after the Indiana tour, my father moved us to live with my grandparents, my mother's parents, in Alaska, over in Caledonia Township.
Okay, so Alaska, Michigan, as opposed to Alaska, yeah.
Yes. And then he went on detached duty to his next duty station, and my parents divorced after that. So we stayed where Mom was from, basically, moved within a 20-mile radius for quite a while.
All right. Now, where did you go to high school?
I went to high school in Wayland. We moved from my grandparents' locality in Caledonia Township to Allegan County when I was in between 4th and 5th grade.
Okay. And then once you graduated from high school, what did you do next?
I went to Hope College for 4 years, of course. And after I left college, I was kind of at a loose end. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I'd taken a couple of examinations, civil service examinations, foreign service examinations. Some of them don't even exist anymore in that form. And I called for interviews a couple of times. The Social Security Administration skimmed the top 1% off the PACE list back then. And while I was waiting, I worked in a family-owned business over in Barry County, which most people around here probably know, Middle Villa. Worked for the family for a couple of years and lived with my grandparents in Alaska, Michigan. And then I got tired of just waiting for something to happen. And the next time I was called for an interview from the PACE examination for civil service, it was for the Army at TARCOM in Detroit, Warren, technically. And I was hired off that interview. That was in late 1976. And I went there, and I came home on weekends to my grandparents, and still worked at the same place for extra money because basic civil service entry level didn't really pay very much.
So what kind of work were you doing at that point?
I was a supply cataloger, and the work was okay. It wasn't particularly interesting after about the first 6 months. There was no mental challenge left. And TARCOM is an unusual installation in military terms because at the time, in an installation of about 5,000 people between TARCOM and TARADCOM, which was the research division side, there were only about 80 military personnel. Everyone else was civil service. And it represented the amalgamation of functions across several different areas in the country. For instance, the supply cataloging function, which was quite small, represented the amalgamation of a group in Ohio and a group in Detroit and a group from someplace else. There were older guys who commuted to Ohio from there.
So was the military essentially contracting at this point, sort of post-Vietnam and...
Yes, and the interesting part of it was that it had been so long since they'd hired civil servants at this particular installation, everybody had been there for a long time, that the contracts were Vietnam-era contracts. So they were written in such a way that if you were drafted, it wasn't a breach of contract. But it didn't say drafted. It said if you were in military service, it did not constitute a breach of contract.
Right.
And they had to hold your job open for you for 5 years because of that. Well, I wasn't particularly happy in Detroit. You know, I didn't grow up in a major urban area. I grew up outside town. And Detroit was a fairly miserable place, unless you have a lot of money and can live in a good area. And a basic entry civil servant can't do that. So I started poking around, and I found out this little loophole in the contract, and I went down and I talked to a Navy recruiter. Never even considered the Army because I had bad associations with my father's military service. But I'd always felt safe in a military environment, living on post and that kind of thing. I was just old enough that I could remember that from the last time. So I talked to the Navy recruiter. I'd considered the Air Force, and I was looking at recruiting materials. And at the time, it was in 1977, and my grandfather had died in January as a result of an accident. Had the accident, went in the hospital, and then had a heart attack while he was in the hospital. And so my grandmother was by herself and was not happy with the fact that I was considering military service. But she did not say, oh, you shouldn't do that. She didn't lecture. The only thing she ever said to me was, you know you're not going to be entirely happy if you do this, because if you start moving around, you're never going to be able to have anything that's nice.
Right.
Everything gets battered and moving. So I put it off for a while because I knew that she didn't like it. And then I looked at it again, went and talked to a recruiter, basically went through all the interview process that was done at the recruiting station for officer personnel. And I was accepted. I found out that I was accepted about 3 weeks after my grandmother died. So I never had to tell her.
Right.
I was sworn in January of 1978, but I didn't have a class date for Officer Candidate School, which was in Newport, Rhode Island. And for most people, in those days, Officer Candidate School was split between two locations, Newport, Rhode Island, and Pensacola, Florida. The folks who went through Pensacola were aviation candidates and selected officer specialty groupings that did a lot of work directly with the aviation community. Right. So people like the intelligence community, those people went through aviation officer candidate school, which is what you saw in Officer and a Gentleman with the drill instructors that yelled at you and the Dunker tank and all that. That's aviation officer candidate school. Officer candidate school in Newport did not have Marine Corps drill instructors. I went in March. I reported on St. Patrick's Day in March. And they deliberately do not tell you what is going to happen to you, because they don't want you to know that there's actually a set time frame during which they're going to treat you, I don't want to say badly, but in a way that people would interpret as badly.
Okay. Now, when you're going out there, is there a whole group of you starting at the same time?
Yes.
All right.
And at that time, there were several different ways to do that. In Newport, Rhode Island, you had the entire range of military personnel. In those days, there were still 4 destroyers in Newport, so you actually had some active forces there. You also had the Naval War College, so you had very senior officer personnel who were going through classes there. You had Surface Warfare Officer School, which was a post-commissioning school that, in those days, only young men went to before they were allowed to go to sea. It basically taught them more than what you learned in officer candidate school about rules of the road and what you were allowed to do, and more of the technical things you needed to know in order to be a ship driver. And then you had officer candidates. You also had NAPSTers, which were our pre-commissioning program at the high school level in the summer. They would be in there for several weeks. And you had what we referred to as oysters, Officer Instruction School. Officer Instruction School was for people who already had medical qualifications, who were direct commissions. They did not have to go through Officer Candidate School, but they did need instruction on how to wear their uniform and what the hair regulations were, and some sort of minor physical training. Officer Candidate School, the normal Officer Candidate School, could run anywhere from 200 100 people to 1,000 in the
How
group
many
at one time.
started with you?
We were quite small, and the reason was rather unique. The 200th Officer Candidate School class went through just before my class, so they were still there when we got there, and there was a class ahead of them that was being commissioned. The 200s were commissioned in June, and they deliberately left a gap so that there would be a 4-week period where there was only one class on board. Not something they usually did. That was because traditionally, up until that point, there were two companies. The classes were divided into, quote, military companies that associated with each other all the time. 2 of the companies were all female. The rest of the companies were all male. During the 4-week period, when we were the only class on board, they integrated the companies. They scrambled all the people and integrated them in teaching sections. They were divided in half so that this company and these 4 of the companies usually had the same classes together, and the other 4 companies had classes together. So they took a women's company in each group, and they inserted men into it and took women out of it and put them in the other companies, and taught us what the men had been taught up until that point, which was how to carry weapons properly and do the manual of arms and for parades and that kind of thing.
Now, what proportion of your class was female?
Approximately 1/4.
Okay. Now, is it your understanding that prior to this integration, there were a lot of things they taught the men that they did not teach the women, or how did that work?
It mainly had to do with things that women were never expected to do in a full duty status. That involved mainly handling of weapons.
Right.
Okay. The real split was after you were commissioned, because you did not go to warfare qualification schools. You only went to a more limited range of duty assignments. They were planning to change that. That was one of the reasons they made the shift at that point. They were already planning to integrate the military academies at that point, but they had not done so.
Right.
The class before us, the women had to sign paperwork that indicated that they knew that it was possible in the future they could be assigned to sea duty.
Right.
We did not. They limited the numbers for a while because they knew it would be difficult. They would have to do it in very small numbers initially. So they said, okay, well, it's not going to be necessary for this class or the next class. We've already got enough women in the previous class that we'll have enough people to experiment with, basically.
Okay. Now, how long was the officer candidate school session?
When I went through, it was 16 weeks. It changes over time. It's ranged, to my knowledge, while I was in, any place between 12 and 16 weeks.
Do you have a sense of how long they had been admitting women to officer candidate school by the time you got there?
Not a really good one. I had a supervisor later who had been in the first group of women that they sent through to some of the more remote duty stations. And they did it the same way they did with the ship integration later. They sent people in pairs, and they sent the officers first before they started amalgamating enlisted women. Mostly because it's easier to change officer quarter accommodations than it is to change enlisted accommodations, so that you have isolated bathrooms and that kind of thing.
Right. You're not packing large numbers of officers together in a barracks or something like that.
Right. You might have 2, you might have 4 that have to share depending on where you are, and you can... Whether or not it's an accurate summation, it was believed that it was less of a problem to have them using the same bathrooms if they were officers.
Okay.
Bit silly. But I know it was pre-1972. I'm not sure how long before that it was.
Okay. Now, in general, when you're in officer candidate school, how well did they seem to be able to deal with having women candidates? Was it something that they were used to and things flowed pretty naturally, or?
They were fairly used to it. Some of the instructors were female. The company officers, the officer who was in charge of taking care of problems or informational needs within each of the officer candidate companies. For the female companies, the company officers were also female. As a matter of fact, they were combined forces because we had 2 British officers who were company officers, 1 male and 1 female. And so we had comparative information on how other countries handled their service integration.
Okay. And what do you think sort of morale was like among the students you were with? Were they looking forward to this? Were they excited about it, or?
Mostly, they found it interesting. It was all volunteer force.
Right.
It was enough post-Vietnam that nobody was worried about that kind of thing. Some people were more nervous than others. Some people were just miserable at school and wanted it to be over. I remember during the time frame when I went through, you basically had your classes and your PT and everything during the week. And you also stood duty. They taught you that as part of your schooling. So they had watches that you had to stand so that you learned how you were supposed to handle those and what the penalties were if you didn't do it properly. At that time, we were allowed Saturday and Sunday off, and you had permission to leave the base, and you did not have to wear a uniform if you were an officer candidate, unlike enlisted personnel who, when they finally receive permission to leave the base while they're still in basic schooling, still have to wear their uniforms. And allowed without supervision. And that was okay, that gave you a break. You could go to McDonald's or something like that and just not worry. If you wanted to, you could get a room in a local hotel and trash the place out instead of having to keep it neat the way you did. You were subject to inspection at any time. There were restrictions on it, but you were told what those were. One of the interesting things that I found about it was when you first reported, they made sure that you understood that on every desk in every room there was a notebook that had a piece of paper in it already that said priorities. So that you understood that if you were ill, a medical priority came before anything you had to do as part of officer candidate school. They didn't want people pretending to be tough and making a situation worse. Sometimes it was a little hard to remember. So you had regular classes, taught you things like celestial navigation that no one ever uses unless they go to sea, and none of the instruments work. Basic engineering concepts, just things to do with Navy administration, how the paperwork works, how ranks and so forth are structured. You had regular PT. You had things that changed intermittently.
PT is physical training?
Okay. Because you had to be able to pass what in those days were referred to as JFKs, because he was the one that instituted the standard of fitness. If you remember, everybody should be able to do certain things.
Right.
So they had a similar set of things for the military, and that was how you had to be able to pass your JFKs. So it was a mile, and actually that was one of the differences between men and women in that time frame, is the number of things you had to do was different. For instance, you had X amount of time to run a particular distance. For the men, it was 1.5 miles. For the women, it was 1.35 miles in the same amount of time.
Okay.
So I was always very proud of myself, and I was never terribly physically fit, that I managed to do the men's distance and a little more in the amount of time that we were allotted. So we also had mandatory swim training. This is the Navy.
Right.
So that's where I learned to swim. And as part of your swim training, you also had particular sessions where they had you jump off from a high level in uniform and basically be able to take your clothes off
right.
to be able to inflate them so they were floatables if you didn't have something like that. And you also had drown proofing, which was how not to expend energy in the water. So it was to teach you to float upright without treading water any more than absolutely necessary, so you didn't expend energy doing that. It was interesting.
So how well did you hold up under all of this kind of training and stuff?
I had no problems with classes. I was fairly miserable about a couple of the specific aspects. I remember actually giving up and calling my mother at one point just to tell her that I was miserable. It'll be over soon. Yes, it can't be over soon enough. I had a compatible person that I shared a room with, fortunately. She and I were the oddballs in the bunch. At that time frame, commissioning programs tended to attract, at least for the women, people from very stable traditional backgrounds. So two-parent families who'd never had any hardship. That did not apply to me, coming from a divorced family. And after they divorced, my mother worked in a factory. It also didn't really apply to my roommate. She had been married before she came into the program and divorced herself, and she smoked. Oh, absolutely unacceptable, which did not bother me because my mother smoked, you know, so we were okay when we were together.
Now, were you allowed to smoke in the rooms, or?
Yes, you were, back in those days. Buildings didn't go non-smoking for a very long time.
Were the people in your class, were they from all over the country? Did they tend to come from certain areas, or?
No, they were from all over the country.
And were a lot of them from Navy families?
No, actually, amazingly enough, most of the ones from Navy families didn't happen to go through in my group. Now, most of the ones from Navy families or other military families did go through officer candidate school if they were female, because you couldn't get into the academy.
Right.
They had all looked at that. One of, not my classmates, but the class before me, and she wound up being with me at my first duty station, was from a Navy family, from a military family. Her father was a Marine Corps colonel, her mother was a Navy nurse, and her brother went to the academy, and he was an aviator. So she's still in. She's a captain. She's at command twice.
All right. Now, what did you do then after you completed officer candidate school?
There's a selection process run by what's called detailing personnel, assignments personnel if you're in the Army, that figure out what to do with groups of people by their rank. They know what the requirements are. At the very basic level, they might take a minor look at your background, but the assumption is that you know whatever you learned in officer candidate school. A lot of the men were assigned to, out of my officer candidate school, were assigned to surface warfare training because they were going into the surface fleet. There were specialists who went through. I think there was one guy in my class who had a different officer designator, tells you what sub-community you're in. And there are warfare communities, so there's the surface warfare community, the submarine warfare community, the aviation warfare community. There are subsets of that, so the special forces guys fall into that group. And then there's restricted line as opposed to unrestricted line. Restricted line people did things like civil affairs and oceanography and intelligence, a number of things. And then there were staff officers who were supply corps officers and people who went into the medical community, specialists like that. Medical community was handled separately because they weren't commissioned as ensigns. They were commissioned at a higher pay grade.
Right.
But everyone else went through this process where their detailing community, which was in Washington at the time, it's in Tennessee now, would look at them and say, okay, I have requirements for people in these areas with these kinds of backgrounds. And they would, and you were allowed to fill out a sheet that said where you were interested in going or what you were interested in doing. And they would try to take that into account, but the needs of the Navy came first. Right. You got assigned wherever. So in my case, the assignments list was posted, and I was going to be going to Naval Facility, Guam. Now I'm sitting there scratching my head, and one of my classmates was a SEAL, prior enlisted, who was being commissioned. And he knew what it involved. And they said, well, he said, they won't be able to tell you anything about it because what they do is classified. But you'll enjoy it. And he was right. I enjoyed the work very much. So much so that I basically stayed in that subset of the community for about 12 years before I did anything else.
Okay. Now, how did they get you up to Guam?
Oh, they issue you a plane ticket.
Do you just
basically.
fly a commercial plane, or do you fly military
That particular
aircraft?
case, it was a charter flight. I mean, they flew me from Baltimore, well, from Newport to Baltimore to the West Coast, and then picked up a charter flight that went out to Guam from there.
And how did Guam strike you when you got there? What did it look like to you?
It was fascinating, being from Michigan. Here you are on a tropical island for the first time. It was actually kind of a good way to do a non-mainland first duty station, because you didn't have to adjust language, you didn't have to adjust money, but it was still a long ways away from home. It was a totally different climate. I discovered that I adored tropical islands. The only thing that truly, truly annoyed me about it was that it had nothing except the most wretched bookstore you have ever seen in your life. And they didn't even do much in the way of ordering for you. But back in those days, the Navy exchange system was still associated with a bookstore chain called Stars and Stripes that didn't belong to the exchange, but that was what they did. They brought books into overseas installations. So you had some choice there, even though you still couldn't order. It was a very small installation that I was at. There were only 100 people in the whole command. And I did enjoy the work. I didn't particularly respect my boss. Not my immediate boss, but the commanding officer. He was an early select for command, an aviator who really wasn't interested in what we did for a living. He had flown in electronics emissions collector bird. And that was what he was really interested in. Even the junior enlisted folks noticed. I remember that one once said something to their section officer, who was the Navy family officer I mentioned earlier. She told me about it afterwards. She said, Seaman so-and-so looked at me and said, "Why doesn't the skipper care about anything that we do?" Now, the XO did. He was from a more diverse background in terms of his assignments, and he was actually senior to the CO, which was very unusual. He did care about what went on, and he didn't really care about the set format you had for giving it to him. He was more interested in whether you knew what was going on and could just tell him.
And to what extent can you describe what it was that you were doing?
To a much greater extent than I used to be able to. In the early 90s, they decided to declassify the basic mission statement.
Okay.
So what we did was, when I first went in, it was referred to by the acronym SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, and became IUSS, the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, when they added different sensors to it. But basically, it amounted to passive anti-submarine warfare. So we had sensors in the water that were permanently there, and we listened. Back in those days, listening was an accurate verb, more so than it became later, because in the first generation systems, you could still plug a set of sound-powered headphones into the machinery and actually listen to the microphones that were in the ocean. But they lost that capability later as the machinery which supported it and displayed the signal in a visual format so that you could look at it and make a determination as to whether you were seeing submarines or something else, became more computerized. It passed through more paths in order to be processed, and you lost the ability to listen to the microphones.
Okay. Now, did you detect much of anything? Could you?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Could you tell a submarine from a whale or things like that?
They taught you how to do that. After I left Officer Candidate School, because of where I was going, I was sent first to a school in Norfolk, which is why I was flying out of Baltimore to go there. And it was basically the same information that they taught to the enlisted personnel in the school that they went through. Anti-submarine warfare was big business from that, shortly before that point, about 5 or 6 years before that point, well, a little longer than that. It existed. They started putting in the sound surveillance system in the early 50s. That's when they started snatching land from people who didn't want to give it up. And putting the stations there, running the cables out to sea with the microphones at the end with the cable layers and listening. But it became, there was a lot more emphasis on it from about the mid-70s until about the early 90s. Once the Soviet threat went away, as far as blue water capability, they de-emphasized it extremely rapidly. It was part of the amalgamation of forces as part of the drawdown. But we saw a fair amount of activity, not a lot where we were. The way we pointed wasn't toward major Soviet activity, although we picked it up in certain areas. What was important was that there were stations in different locations, and because you were a passive system rather than an active system, the way that you located things was crosshairs between, and it was still a probability area. It was still someplace in this area with this amount of probability there is a submarine of this kind because it's making this kind of noise.
Now, do you have a sense of sort of what the larger purpose of all of this was? I mean, what good did the data actually do us?
Actually, we were fairly well informed for junior people that way, because at a very junior level, not my first duty station, but my second, because I was on Guam for 17 months. And from there I went to Norfolk, to the processing center, the next level up, where they got the information from all the stations in their basin and looked at it and made a determination as to where they thought submarines were. So you got to watch the reporting process and who it was reported to, and they made sure it was pounded into your head with a mallet, if necessary, that if you make a decision that says that the center of the probability area for what you believe to be a submarine is outside this particular area, if it's any closer to the U.S. mainland, you are going to push a button to release a message that's going to cost the United States government $1 million. Be sure that you know what you're doing.
Okay.
Because if we pushed that button and said the submarine was this much closer, they would move the entire strategic bombing force back away from the East Coast farther. So their information got used.
Okay. And so did that kind of thing happen?
Absolutely. It was always a big deal. You had to call the chain of command when you were telling people that you were moving. When I say outside a certain area, it was normal for Soviet submarines to patrol within a predictable big ocean area. Right. If they came closer than that, then they were violating their own normal patterns, potentially, and there could be a reason to be concerned.
And how regular a thing was that?
Not regular. It might happen once every couple of years. I can remember it happening twice while I was in Norfolk.
Okay. And how long did they have you in Norfolk that first time?
That was 27 months. It was an odd length of tour because in those days, you had to apply. It went up and down. Sometimes it was automatic. You were automatically looked at for accession from the Naval Reserve, which was what you were commissioned in, to the regular Navy. And sometimes you had to apply at a certain point in your career. And it was between when you were in 02 and in 03 that you did that. Well, because you didn't have a commitment beyond your original 4-year commitment, usually, it made your tours a bit odd in length the second time around. Normal tours aren't like that unless you're extended for some Navy reason. You get assigned someplace for a year or 24 months or 36 months if you're married, or if it's a especially good duty station like Pearl.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, what sort of duty station is Norfolk? I mean, there's a lot of Navy there.
The Navy defines things as in two different parameters, on two different axes. One is in CONUS, out CONUS, and the other is preferred, non-preferred. Okay? And within preferred, non-preferred, there's preferred shore, non-preferred shore, and there's preferred sea, non-preferred sea. At different times. This changes from time to time, the way they define it. And things drop in and out of categories too. So I'm not in touch with what's going on with it right now. Haven't been for a while. But Norfolk was considered preferred shore because it was a fairly developed area. There were a lot of different things you could select from and stay in the area if it met the needs of the Navy. Unlike the Air Force, which allowed you to homestead, okay? The Navy discouraged that. The Air Force allowed it. You simply had to accept the fact that if you were going to homestead in a place where there wasn't a slot at the next promotion level for you to be promoted into, you weren't going to be promoted as long as you stayed there. The Navy was transitioning in the early 80s out of the mindset that you see in a lot of the old movies where you had the old salt who was still very junior in terms of responsibility, but had been in the Navy for a long time and was the, quote, sea daddy for the young guys coming in to make sure that they understood what was going on and the way things worked. They were trying to discourage that. They wanted progression and skills and up or out for them. So there was a lot of legislation, which also affected the officer community in the early 80s. There was an act called DOPMA, the Defense Officer Promotion something other Act, and it changed the rules. The rules up until that point had been that if you came into the service and in a commission status, and you went regular, once you went regular, you didn't have any time limit on your contract, unlike your first set of 4 years commitment. Then you had to ask to leave. You were considered at certain points for promotion, but if you made it to 04, you were safe.
Now, what does sort of 02, 03, 04 refer to specifically?
The pay grades. So it's easier usually when you're talking multi-service type things to use pay grades when you're talking rather than use ranks because, of course, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Army all use a set of ranks that are similar to each other in the way they're verbalized. And the Navy's is different. Yeah,
to be a captain in the Navy is quite different from being a captain in the Army or the Marines.
Oh, absolutely. So, and 01 in the Navy is an ensign, and 01 in the other services is a second lieutenant.
Right.
And of course, you really get screwed up, you start throwing the British Navy in there. But, so 04, which is a major in the other services, is lieutenant commander. If you made it as far as that, then they had to let you stay till 20. Once you were accepted a promotion under the DOPMA Act, if you didn't hit a gate and you weren't selected after 2 opportunities for selection, they could force you out.
Hit a gate, what does that mean?
Meet a certain, make it to the time frame when you were going to be considered for promotion to the next rank. I tend to use that term even though it isn't really used that much in the US military. It's a British term. But it amounts to the same thing. You're considered for promotion at particular lengths of service. Basically, it stays the same, but it varies a little bit on a curve, depending on the size of the grouping available in any given time for consideration. As an example, in 1978, when I was commissioned, the maximum age for commissioning was you had to be commissioned before your 26th birthday. That was the last year, by the way. I was 26 that year, but not until winter. But in 79, 80, and I think 81, they raised the maximum commissioning age to 30 or 30, I think. It was 34 for some of the limited duty type assignments. And one of my friends, who is my age, came in a year later because they had changed that. Well, that has an effect on how many people you have available in what's called a year group, all the people that were commissioned that fiscal year. So year group 79 was much larger than year group 78. So they didn't consider all of them at the same time. When you start getting into the higher ranks, it hasn't thinned out as much, so you have more people for consideration. So they may choose to split that group and consider part of them in this year and part of them in this year for promotion to the next pay grade. So in my case, it's almost automatic to make O2, lieutenant junior grade. It's 2 years from your commissioning date. Right. And when I went through, it was 3% of the people didn't make it. And it was for some specific reason, medical, bad performance, very bad performance, not to make O2. Guys in those days would actually react, my God, I knew a 3%er. Because nobody knew somebody who didn't make it. And then it was almost that high for promotion to O3. Then they started cutting, because at O3 people could get out. They didn't have to go over and become regular Navy. So you'd lose a group of people that way who didn't go beyond their original commitment. But that wasn't enough people for the number of people, which they'd make a determination based on the number of slots the Navy had at that grade. And in those communities, how many people they needed to promote. How many aviators do I need to promote? How many surface warfare guys do I need to promote to O4? And so they have boards in Washington in those days, in Tennessee now, that look at your performance. And they rank everybody who is eligible. And they do it in 3 piles. The boards, I've never sat on one, but I know people who have, and they do it the same way all the time. These obviously make it, these obviously don't make it. Okay, let's talk about these guys, right. Which is the huge amount in the middle.
Okay. Now, if you don't make it, can you still stay in at your current rank? I mean, you can stay on indefinitely, or do they try to push you out?
Not indefinitely. That was the change that was made under DOTMA. You could stay before DOTMA. You could stay after the first look, even after DOTMA, because you got 2 primary looks when you were considered to be in the zone. And they actually looked at you sometimes below the zone the year before that, and above the zone the year after that, pre-DOTMA. But once you hit the second look after DOTMA went into effect, they could force you out within 6 months.
And did you know people who had that happen to?
It happened to me. I was in the general unrestricted line community. A lot of the women who were commissioned, most of them, as a matter of fact, that weren't in specialty groups, couldn't go into warfare communities. At that point, you couldn't become a surface warfare officer or an aviation officer or a submarine officer. But you were still an unrestricted line officer, meaning you were in the line of succession to command if there were catastrophes going on. So they would send you to support positions that were defined as needing any unrestricted line officer, because some of the jobs were defined that way. And that's how you got into integrated undersea warfare and training commands and administrative duties of various kinds. And communications, because communications officers were not a specialty at that point. And eventually, as we progress and there are more people and women are being allowed into the academies, they reached a point where they said, okay, we now have a viable pipe that goes into the warfare communities. So do we actually need general unrestricted line officers anymore? And the answer was, well, maybe not. Let's look. What functions do they perform that are vital to what we're doing? And that's the way they came out in 4 groupings. There was training, administration, communications, and specialty services like anti-submarine warfare. And we, on the technical side, anti-submarine warfare and communications, were much smaller than this big group of people who did administrative things. Right. And they said, okay, well, these are viable, but we need to figure out if we're going to change the community to be something else. What size does it need to be? How many people do we need to have in it at what levels? And that's going to take us a couple of years because we have to do it as a study. So they talked to the Chief of Naval Operations, and Admiral Kelso said, okay, this was in the early 90s when the drawdown was happening.
Right.
After the wall fell down.
Mm-hmm.
And the Navy, the Air, all the services were cutting, and everybody did it differently. The Air Force just went whack and got rid of a whole bunch of pilots all at once. They didn't let people who were going through ROTC at college, which is one of their pilot training pipelines. They just didn't let them go into pilot programs unless they were superb at what they did. The Marine Corps did it. It all fell at different points, depending on what service you were in, how they implemented it. The Navy did it in a very measured fashion with cuts over 5 years. But the community I was in had an exemption because they were trying to figure out what size it needed to be and what they were going to call it. They eventually decided to call it fleet support, and instead of being a designator as a 4-number unit. So surface warfare officers were 1110. General unrestricted line officers were 1100. They were going to transition us to a restricted line community, 1700. And they did that so that the last 3 or 4 years I was in, I was a 1700, but they switched it back after I retired because it didn't work well and are doing it differently now. But at the point where the 5 years ran out, it was the last year the Navy was going to make any cuts. Mm-hmm. And they looked at it and they said, okay, now, I was already in 05 by then. Mm-hmm. So retirement eligible,
yep.
And the whole works. They said, we're going to need to cut, I think it was 33 05s and half a dozen 04s this year. That's our share for the Navy. So that's the way things stood without retirement papers being in. So a whole bunch of retirement papers went in, and I was in the zone that year for selection to 06. Mm-hmm. And I was also in the zone for cutting.
Right.
So if I had made 06 on the first look, I would have still been in for another, whatever I decided to stay, 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. But I didn't. And the boards met at the same time that year, the 06 board and the SERB board, the Selective Early Retirement Board.
So you got downsized.
I got downsized.
Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit off of the bureaucratic angle of it quite so much. You were based, you go to Guam, you go to Norfolk. Where do you go after that?
Japan.
All right. And where do they send you in Japan?
I worked out of the naval base in Yokosuka. And I worked with a special operations detachment that was part of the staff. It was really very interesting in a physical environment sense because it was before a lot of the new structures were built. Mm-hmm. You got to watch the way the relationship worked between the Japanese forces and the U.S. forces and the two governments about what you had permission to do, because the base officially belongs to Japan. And they own all the buildings. And so they have to agree with what you do to the buildings. I worked with the rest of the operations department. Most of the headquarters staff worked in a building, maybe a quarter of a mile inside the front gate, including the admiral. But the operations department worked across the parking lot in a cave with construction on the inside. And it was one of the caves that the Japanese used to protect forces from bombing during World War II. There were lower levels of the cave. I think there used to actually be a hospital facility there that were flooded. And the command master chief, the most senior enlisted person on the staff, had permission to take small groups down a couple of times a year. He'd take you, if you wanted to go, on a little tour so you could see the scorpions in the water and whatever. So that was interesting. I worked for a commander who was a surface warfare qualified gentleman who had been in Vietnam, who had been riverine forces. Mostly, there were 4 officers who worked for him, 2 women, 2 men. We traded duties with each other because we had to go TDY on a regular basis, temporary duty in another location. So one of us would be there of each group, and the other one would be away. doing other things.
So were you doing similar kinds of work
Yes.
before, still kind of listening in effect? Yeah. And what was the environment like just to live in Japan at that point?
It's fascinating. It really was. I had the best of both worlds because if you were in Yokosuka, you had quarters in bachelor officers' quarters, and you kept those while you were gone. So your stuff was there, and when you were away, you actually lived on the Japanese economy. So I lived in what would have been a residence big enough for 3 or 4 people, a family, a small family in Japan, but it would fit in this room, the entire thing. So I had to live with what was typical Japanese country plumbing at the time. So I had a wonderful bath. I had an ofuro, which was kind of a cross between a bathtub and a hot tub, the way we understand it. It didn't work the same way. You would fill it up with water, and then it had a gas directly applied heat to the piping underneath, so it was incredibly hot. And you left that on the whole time, so it stayed hot. So it was a soaking tub, and you had a shower head in the wall besides that, because you cleaned off before you got in the tub. I learned how to do public bathing in Japan because you can, and it's isolated by sex, so it's not expected to be a problem. However, the toilet facilities were interesting. It was basically an indoor outhouse. So it was a little addition on the exterior of the building, and you accessed it from inside, but it was separate enough that it wasn't an issue. It was a standard fixture, but it didn't have plumbing attached.
Okay.
It worked just like an outhouse, and someone would come in once a year. The landlord had someone come in and pump the thing out. So it was interesting. I had to learn enough Japanese so that I could buy groceries locally. It was very frustrating. You couldn't buy anything to read. Everything, of course, was in kanji. You usually traveled by the national line trains when you could, except for places where you knew where you were going, because there's the publicly owned, the national lines, and then there are privately owned lines that are in competition. Well, the public lines, because they are publicly owned, nationally owned, have to have the characters that identify the station in both Japanese characters and English language characters in Romanji. So you could read the station name.
Right.
So where the private lines share the station, it's not an issue, but there were a few stations that were only on that private line. And if you didn't already know where you would know where you were or how to get off. The base taught you how to use the trains. It was part of intercultural training. It was interesting. They had you for 3 days when you first reported, and they would expose you to various things that you could expect and tell you what not to do. You know, the standard gesture you make with babies. I've got your nose.
Yeah.
Don't ever do that in Japan.
Okay.
Never, never, never do that in Japan. That's obscene. And some mother will lose her cool and call for assistance rather than whack you over the head like an American mother would with her purse for doing that to her child. So they taught you not to do that. They taught you the difference in physical characteristics. Body language is different in Japan. This is me and you when you're talking. In the U.S., if you wanted someone to come to you, you would do this. In Japan, that's only for animals and small children.
Okay.
This is for grown-ups. So this is not bye-bye, this is come.
In general, how well did the Americans on your base seem to get along with the Japanese?
Fairly well. Most of the guys who were assigned to ships that came in and out of Yokosuka liked the fact that they could go out into town on the Hunch, which was the main street that had small restaurants and bars on it, and just to have a good time. But most of them adjusted quite well. The stuff that you see in the news occasionally is shocking as it is that shocking because it's so unusual for something like that
You mean
to happen.
attacks on girls or things like that, yeah.
The neat thing about Japan in those days was one of the common things that was discussed was, and they'd even tell you in intercultural relations, that a lot of aspects of Japanese society in the early 80s when I was there, because I got there in 82 and I left in 84, were still like the 50s in the United States. One of the things they taught you, and I don't remember it anymore, is the phrase to yell if anybody bothered you, because every man in the area would converge and shoot him away.
And how long were you based there?
A little over 2 years. I was actually due to rotate in July of 84 and stayed until November so that they could have an overlap with the person coming in behind me, no gap. It was interesting.
Okay. And where'd you go after that?
Back to Norfolk, actually to the exact same place that I left, but to a different job in the organization. So I was doing similar things. And I was there for a little over 2 years. And then I transferred to Pearl Harbor.
Okay. And what was working in Pearl Harbor like?
Oh, Pearl is great. It deteriorated in terms of being a tropical island environment since then because urban area, 10 lanes of traffic on the freeway. Most people don't associate that with Oahu, but it wasn't like that then. The freeway was only 4 lanes in its busiest location. I lived outside town. There's all the history in Pearl. I mean, when I was first stationed there, the Missouri wasn't there yet, but because she was actually still running around because they'd recommissioned the battleships during that time frame. But I, got to go to the Arizona and climb Diamond Head and look at the emplacements up there where the guns were. The bullet holes are still in the building that Pacific Air Force's headquarters is in over at Hickam Air Force Base, and you can look at them from the strafing run. One of my friends who lives there, Connie, was born there and spent a large amount of her youth there running in and out. Her father was an Air Force chaplain. And she ran the local USO facility for a while at the airport and has all these old postcards of where the USO facilities were in World War II and pictures of different things that used to happen then. It was Guam, only it was much better. It smelled better, it had a greater variety of vegetation, it had gorgeous beaches everywhere. The traffic was not bad then.
Better bookstores?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, when I was living in Japan, one of the guys who was on the staff, but not in operations, he was in intelligence, used to come to Hawaii 4 times a year to go to Walden Books at Pearl Ridge Mall. And he would buy like 5 boxes of books, and they'd mail them all to him. But yes, definitely better bookstores.
Okay. And were you continuing to do the same kind of work that you'd been doing?
No,
Was it changing?
actually. I was assigned to the Pac Fleet staff. So the senior operational Navy officer on the island was a 4-star. There was another Navy 4-star on the island, but he was in charge of the Joint Command up at Camp Smith and had Army and Air Force and whatever working for him and was in charge of a geographical area at the time, as opposed to being in charge of all the fleet forces in the Pacific Ocean. So I was on his staff, but I was in intelligence. I wasn't in operations. I had asked for I tried to figure out a way to describe what I wanted on my duty preference sheet. And I described it as technical intelligence, so my literal-minded detailer went through and hit on something that was defined as technical intelligence on the fleet staff. So I wound up there in a job where I eventually handled the control of what intelligence was disseminated to fleet units afloat. If you wanted to be added to a message distribution for something, you came in with a message and said da-da-da-da-da, and I would say, okay, or no, you're not supposed to have that by policy. And if I said yes, I would just send a message saying okay and send it to the right people. And the person who had release authority would sign it. That was my Navy 06 that I worked for. And if I said no, I had to add justification paperwork to it and get the admiral to sign it because you weren't allowed to say no without permission. You had to have a very good reason. So I did that. I handled intelligence exchange conferences, the coordination of them. So any formal arrangements we had with foreign navies to share information usually involved having a conference once or twice a year to talk about common concerns.
Right.
And I would handle setting those up for the 06.
And what countries were involved in that?
We have formal relationships with Japan, of course, and with Korea. We have mutual defense treaties with both of them. As a matter of fact, 5 of the 7 standing mutual defense treaties that the United States has are in the Pacific, and those are 2 of them. We also had a regular meeting with Thailand, one of the other formal defense arrangements, and a regular meeting with our Four Eyes allies, so Canada, Great Britain, and Australia. That was the fun one. Everybody spoke English and got into all kinds of mischief.
Okay. Was it generally interesting work to be doing relative to what you had been, or?
I found parts of it more interesting than others. There were things about setting up intelligence exchange conferences that were vastly boring and were basically secretarial work, but you also had to be able to make the decisions that went with them, which secretaries weren't allowed to do. Some of it was, I enjoyed the exposure to the intelligence community enough so that because I was in this job and because the secondary technical skill that you earned in what I did with passive anti-submarine warfare was also intelligence related, it gave me what was called a subspecialty in intelligence. 2 of them, one for joint intelligence and one for technical. So I was allowed to list intelligence as a section on my duty preference sheet of things that I would like to do in the future. And I kept myself on that list for a long time and wound up affecting my final duty assignment. So.
All right. Now, how long then were you in Pearl Harbor?
Longer than I was supposed to be. We went through a time frame while I was there where they were doing fiddly weird things with the budget, and they wound up extending everybody in the Navy where they were for an additional 2 months, and then there was an additional 2 months besides that got added on to me, so I was actually there, instead of 36 months, I was there for almost 40. I was there for 39. I enjoyed myself.
Okay. So when did you leave there then?
I left at the end of April in 1990 and went to California.
Okay, and where did they base you there?
Naval Facility Centerville Beach, which is the same type of duty I had been doing, but as an operations officer rather than as someone who was directing the watch. And that base, well, it's silly to say it's not there anymore, but it's not there anymore. I mean, physically it's still there, but it decommissioned as a base shortly after I left 3 years later.
All right. And as a place to live, did you like it better or worse than Hawaii or Norfolk or wherever?
I liked it better than Norfolk, far less than Hawaii. I thought I was going to freeze to death. After I'd been in Hawaii for 3 years, I'd lost all of my resistance to any kind of cold. Well, believe it or not, the area of California that I was in is 250 miles north of San Francisco and on the coast. And if it got up to 75 in the summer, it was considered quite warm. I remember in desperation a couple of times actually just getting in my car and driving inland or south for an hour to warm up. So it was fairly isolated as a location for California, not what you think of as being California at all because of where it was. It's up by, I actually lived in Eureka, so Eureka was about halfway between Humboldt State and Arcata, and the base was outside a little tourist trap Victorian-style town. So I lived in a town that was the biggest thing for 100 miles around, basically. It was 20,000 people. It's So, in those days, and it actually had a mall. It had had a mall for 5 years when I got there. A little one, about the size of one wing of Woodland. So it was okay. I had enough shopping there. I liked the physical environment. We were by Trinity Alps and the state parks all through there, and Redwood National Forest, and the California state parks that are redwoods oriented were surrounded by all of this. So it was nice in that respect. It was very difficult for me to swim, which is what I did for my physical training, testing every year that I'd taken up in Hawaii when it became legal to do that instead of only running. I had to do it at the local community college, which had very limited hours. So it was okay. It wasn't special. There were things I disliked about the environment a lot, not about California itself. Hard. I wouldn't go back there.
Well,
There are other things of California I like, but I had bad associations with a couple of things that happened there. My mother died while I was there, for one thing.
Okay. And then from there, where'd you go after that?
War College, Newport.
Back to Newport?
Back to Newport, which granted me my master's degree. The Navy War College is a degree-granting institution. So, because at the time, I don't know if they still are or not, they kept the same guy on there in charge for quite a while longer than they normally did, while they came up with another admiral who had a PhD, who therefore met the requirements to keep the degree-granting status. So I was there for 10 months for school and had a wonderful time being with classmates who were basically peers. And from there, I went to Portugal.
All right. And what do they have you doing there?
I was the officer in charge of the U.S. unit that supported U.S. personnel attached to a NATO staff. So there's a NATO staff in Oeiras in Portugal, Sint Iberland. And the 3-star in charge of Sint Iberland is Portuguese. The deputy, 2-star, is American. And the operations officer, 1-star, is a Brit. And we also had a couple of German officers on staff and a couple of Spanish liaison officers. We technically had a French liaison officer, but he was never there because it was an additional duty for him. He was actually the attaché at the French embassy, and he was in Lisbon most of the time. That was fun. The unattached people my age who were sort of my peers were Brits, so I wound up hanging out with the unattached Brit officers on the staff. One of them is still a friend. She was the nursing sister in charge of, who worked in the medical support unit. The Americans owned the dentist, the Brits owned the doctor and nurse. So we were all treated by each other's medical people. And she retired about 5 years after that, after she got back to England, and lives in Bath, and I visited her a couple of times.
And what kind of work were you doing there?
Basic administrative work. I owned the postal clerk, who was a subset of the Air Force Post Office that ran out of the embassy. I owned a small detachment of people that actually belonged to Rota, Spain, one of whom was a personnelman specialist, and 2 of whom were dispersing people who made sure that we got paid and who had money so that we could change money when we had U.S. money into Portuguese money, rather than keep local bank accounts in Portuguese funds and lose money all the time. I also owned a couple of administrative personnel, a yeoman seaman, who kept records, cut orders if I needed to send people for specialized medical treatment to Spain, where the hospital was. And I owned the dentist and the dental technician. I also had 2 civilians who worked for me who were technically Portuguese nationals. One of them was actually Scottish, who was married to a Portuguese national. One of them was a housing specialist. She did 2 things. She ran the Admiral's quarters, which we rented for him, and took care of dealing with any maintenance issues or dealing with a landlord. And she also helped U.S. people coming in find places to live, because we didn't have military housing. Everybody lived on the economy and had a special allowance for it. The other civilian helped with logistics with transporting people's personal property in and out. And she had worked for the embassy in South Africa for a long time, the U.S. Embassy, and moved home. And technically, both of my civilians worked for the embassy system,
right,
because the entire group of U.S. support people that were there originally started out as an extension of the embassy staff attached to the attaché, and then when they put a NATO staff there, they took the flag billet away, put it there, and some of the people went there. So they still technically owned my civilians. We didn't have hiring authority locally. It was a confusing situation because the person who had all the oversight over me was the deputy, the U.S. two-star. But technically, I worked for the admiral in London for the Sincus Navier. So.
Now, was it a group that kind of worked together pretty well? I mean, was it a...
Pretty much so. It was interesting when you did Hispanic Heritage stuff while I was there, because at one point my postal clerk's wife was Mexican. My yeoman was second generation Mexican. So was his wife, high school sweetheart. My personnelman was Spanish. My DK chief, my dispersing chief, was of Hispanic extraction, Filipino, and my dental clerk's husband was Portuguese.
And could they all talk to each other?
Oh, yes, it was fascinating. Belinda, who was the yeoman's wife, used to just whack him over the head occasionally. His first name was Fidel, by the way, and he had a goony sense of humor, so he took advantage of it. He would chatter away and think that he was speaking more Portuguese than he was, and she would just go, "You're not speaking Portuguese, Fidel, you're speaking Spanish." She was learning more of it as they went along. And so I had radiomen who were on the NATO part of the staff that I supported, one who was from South America someplace, one who was from Puerto Rico. It was very interesting doing Hispanic Heritage Day with all those guys there.
Right. Okay. Where'd you go after that?
I had orders out of there to the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington.
Was that your last assignment?
That was my last assignment. I did not work at DIA proper. I worked in the Pentagon in the section that belonged to the Joint Staff. DIA provides all of the intelligence personnel who are part of the Joint Staff J2. So they don't count against the limitation on the number of people you can have on the Joint Staff, the legal limitation. And I worked with those people. So I worked in the Pentagon the whole time.
Okay. And what kind of work were you doing there?
I did two different things. The first 2 years I was there, I was the deputy division chief of the group of people who were all about 60-40, 60% civilian, 40% military, who handled response to crisis and current intelligence issues in support of the Joint Staff. The last year that I was there, I swapped out with one of my Marine Corps compatriots and went from one division to another division and went to the group that stood watches and directly supported the general on the operations side, who was also standing watch for crisis situations. So I handled a team of people that had area specialists and subject matter specialists in it, like guys who belonged to the National Security Agency who were electronics intelligence emission specialists, a CIA guy, service desk officers, so I had a Navy desk officer, and then I had a guy who handled Eurasia, and a guy who handled the Pacific area, and a guy who handled Latin America specialists in there, about a dozen people on the team.
Okay. And did you have crises to respond to?
Oh, absolutely. During that time frame, there was always a bunch of nasty stuff going on in Africa that you were keeping track of. We were also, it was post-desert, but we were still flying Northern Watch and Southern Watch. You know.
Over Iraq. Yeah.
Right. So there were things that you had to watch about what was going on with the flights, reasons that you would have to call the J2 or notify the general who was standing the watch on the other side of the wall. There were things to do with monitoring missile launches, either announced or unannounced, that you had to deal with. And you had drills about what to do if it were the real thing. those were interesting.
In general, of the people from the different branches of the service and so forth, and the civilians and military, do they work together effectively in these units?
Yes, in an environment that joint, they did. When you go back to Navy culture and you are exposed to someone who's in a part of the Navy that has a lot of community prestige, say the naval aviation community, you will find guys that had a joint tour that just hated their joint tour. But there was legislation in the mid-'80s about joint experience being a requirement for promotion to levels beyond a certain point. So they all have to do it if they want to be promoted.
And then, over the course of your time in the Navy, did the atmosphere sort of change at all in terms of what it was like to be a woman in the service there? I mean, did it get easier, or did attitudes stay about the same?
I don't know that you would describe it as being easier. There are differences. The ability to go to different types of duty assignments changed. It increased. I remember my first duty station was when they were going down Guam, was when they were looking at sending the first women to flight school. And they were taking applicants from active service also. My commanding officer at the time asked me if I was going to apply. Well, I have corrected eyesight. And I hadn't been wearing glasses for very long at that point. I didn't start wearing them until about a year before I went in the service. And he didn't realize, because I was always wearing tinted glasses, that my glasses were in fact prescription. And they weren't taking anybody with eyesight that was corrected. So that was one thing. I watched as they expanded the number of types of afloat units that women could be assigned to, both officers and enlisted. The friend that I mentioned that was one of the first people that I knew that was from a Navy family who'd had command twice. She went from our first duty station on Guam to an assignment on a submarine tender on the East Coast, and stayed surface Navy after that. And all her commands have been in that community, different types of ships both times. It's far less restrictive than it was in terms of duty assignments. Attitudes, it was bumpy for a while because, of course, no one really expected to have to take into account what they should have expected to take into account, which is how do you deal with a force that's getting pregnant? So they've learned to cope with that, and there were some very negative vibes about that for a while. They had to change all the rules at one point about pregnancy discharge, because at one point the only time you could get a pregnancy discharge was, in fact, if you were pregnant, and then later it became not a cause for discharge. Voluntary or involuntary. I remember when I was stationed in Pearl, a guy in a restaurant, I had gone someplace at lunch in uniform, asking me, there weren't very many customers in at the time, so he was idle, whether I had any problems with authority. And you say no. If there are people with authority issues, they've mostly weeded them out by the time where you have to start dealing with them, except as a very junior officer. But I noticed a major difference when I took the uniform off.
What do you mean?
Much, much harder just to get things done. Because eventually it finally sank into the culture enough that they didn't look at the person, they only looked at the uniform and the rank. So yes, it made a difference because you have different physical requirements, but it didn't make the kind of difference it did when I first came in. There are still restrictions. There are still places you can't go. There are no women in submarines. And that was really the only thing I would ever have been interested in personally, would be duty in submarines. Aviation didn't interest me, and neither did surface warfare.
Did you have a sense that there were a lot of naval officers around, especially when you came in, who didn't really think that there should be women there in the first place?
In the combat forces? Oh yeah. It's still a problem, I think, some places in the Army. And it's very hard to deal with on a public relations basis when you have people under attack that is in fact related to the fact that they're women. in areas like the desert.
And were you aware of problems with things like just sexual harassment and that sort of thing going on?
And we talk about it. It was a subject of discussion. Have you ever been sexually harassed? I was surveyed a lot of times, mostly because I respond to them when they send them to me. And I never personally felt sexually harassed. I knew people who did. I just was luckier.
Now, you were based in California at the point when the tailhook scandal came out. What sort of response was there on your base, or how did
Oh, that
deal
was
with that?
interesting. We had an administrative officer who was a lieutenant, a very junior lieutenant, 03, she'd only just made it. And she had come from an aviation unit, even though she was not an aviator. So she had gone to tailhook one year. And she actually knew the woman who was the prime point of contention during what was going on. And she said, very privately in discussions, that she probably brought it on herself to a limited extent. No should still have been no. But her behavior tended to be a bit wild, and it led to things it didn't need to lead to. Also, my assistant operations officer, because in California I was the operations officer for the base, was a Navy aviator who was a lieutenant, who had been to tailhook in the past, but had not been to that one. So you would have discussions about what people went into tailhook expecting. And your basic response from most people who weren't involved in the actual tailhook convention where the problem occurred was tailhook started out as a professional association where there were no seniority rules, okay? Anybody could say anything to whoever was there. So if you were an O2, a Lieutenant JG, you could tell it the way you saw it to the 06 aviators who were there who could influence the community. You had one of the organizers were responsible for setting up the venue and dealing with the administrative details and setting up the professional seminars, because they had very, very good professional seminars associated with tailhook. And the other thing that you went in expecting was a lot of drinking. Okay, you expected that. You didn't necessarily expect misbehavior. You did expect a lot of drinking. I had to certify that none of my subordinates had been in attendance at tailhook in writing to the Navy, so that there was, and that went into their records that said that they were not there. There was a service record entry on it. Later, when I was at War College, one of my classmates, who was also not just a classmate of the larger class, but was also in my seminar, was the guy who organized that tailhook. He told us right up front that that's who he was in the meeting. At the time, he had been on a fast track for flag officer. He had an assignment as a CAG, it was the person who runs all the aviators afloat on a carrier, that he was about to go to after this was over with. And there was an inkling that there was an occurrence at the conference, which he knew about only from having been told. It wasn't something he witnessed. He had his wife at the conference. A lot of the guys brought their wives to the conference. And I met her, and she said the most serious thing that she endured while she was there was being pinched a couple of times, and she turned around and whacked whoever it was. But he went ahead and he'd asked his chain of command if they thought that there would be a problem if he went ahead. He was supposed to deploy. And they said, no, go ahead. And he deployed, and then it started. Constant interaction with legal. They wound up having to fly him back from sea, assign him to a shore staff. He was never going to make it beyond the level that he was. It was a terrible burden to them emotionally to go through this over and over and over at each level of investigation. And I remember running into her gone to the uniform shop for something, and she was there getting out of the car, probably picking something up for him. And I looked at her, and she had the funniest look on her face. And I went over to her and said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "Yes, it's over. It's finally over." And she just bawled for half an hour. It was bad that it had that kind of effect on somebody who did nothing wrong.
Mm-hmm. Was it something that seemed to kind of have a fallout beyond that in the Navy? Were there policy changes or directives coming in? Or
Oh yeah, there was, of course, a much greater emphasis on harassment training.
Mm-hmm.
They revamped the program, redid all the standard training. I think the training itself, excuse me, it became more effective.
Mm-hmm.
In that it was pointed, it was slightly modernized. It was pointed, they did a lot of work to try to make it more readily understandable. And, oh, there it is. Pertinent to a different age group coming in. It had negative effects too. Tailhook was a very valuable forum. The aviation community has a couple of things going for it in the Navy. One of them was the fact that it had this professional consortium where people could learn things together. It was a valuable, I don't want to call it a bonding experience, it sounds so touchy-feely, but it did make them tighter knit as a community and better able to trust each other in terms of professional judgment, what they'd been exposed to. It also exposed structural and functional problems to the entire chain of command from the junior point of view. That was one of the reasons it was a safe location. Nothing went out of there. I mean, you could be disrespectful to anybody you wanted to, and have it handled the way it was supposed to be. It was similar to the way, in a way, the Naval aviation community handles safety incidents. There's a no blame. You tell everything so that they can make safety determinations properly on the equipment. That became much more limited in terms of trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, from where you were, did you kind of have the impression that, to a certain degree, where there was excess or whatever, it was in part kind of maybe characteristic of the aviation community as opposed to the rest of you? The pilot's a different bunch of people.
Pilots are a different bunch of people. You have to have a totally different kind of personality to operate successfully as a pilot. You put pilots in a group, and pilots tend to behave like herd animals.
Yep.
Submariners tend to be loners. They have to be. I mean, you're in an extremely isolated situation where if you can't make your own privacy around you, you can't function for the long periods of time underwater deployed. Aviators also tend to be of an age group, young. I had a friend who was an academy grad, who was a surface warfare officer. And in the academy, because you're there for 4 years, in summers, they give you exposure to the different warfare communities so you can see where you might have aptitude. They really wanted him to go into aviation. He had the reflexes for it, you see.
Yeah.
But he didn't care for the environment. He was not a herd animal. And when he was out deployed at different points, he always had a plan when they were going to be in port for something that he was going to do. And the junior aviators, that was never the case. It was always, well, what's the group going to do? Well, I'm not going to wait for the group to decide what to do. I'm going to have a plan to do something that I want, that I want to see in this strange area, or that I want to experience. And if you want to go with me, that's fine. So yes, aviators are different. They do They tend to be extroverted personalities in the very cliched sense of the word, needing the other people around for interaction. They can function on their own. They have to be able to function on their own, especially if they're fighter pilots.
Right.
But that's not how they socialize. There was, when I was a lieutenant at JG, so my second duty station, first time I was in Norfolk, I went to a class that was developed for the entire Navy for junior officers in leadership management and education training. Well, in Norfolk, it was a combined class of the version for aviation and the version for everyone else, because there were slight differences, but they didn't have enough people to handle it separately. So they combined the instructors, and I went through over at, I think we held it at Naval Amphib Base, but we had a lot of aviators in that particular class. So at lunchtime one day, they put on a tape that was by a flight surgeon who had been researching the topic for several years. And he had produced this instructional video that was kind of controversial as far as the aviators were concerned. And these guys, this is their first opportunity to see it. Well, he had developed a theory that you could predict stress problems in aviators soon enough to be able to catch them in a safety sense. If you watched their behavior patterns, and behavior patterns varied on a scale, he said, of 1 to 10. He used to rate it from 0 to 10, but the P3 guys objected to being a 0. So he had to change it. But the example that he used was P3 guys, you judge a party's excellence by the quality of the food and wine served at the party. And then he went up a level, and he said, these guys, the judge party's excellence by the amount, by the quantity that was consumed, the amount of money that was spent on the party. And then you get to the fighter guys, just short of fighter pilots, the next level up, and that's by the size of the barbell. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the fighter pilots, and they judge party by the size of the bill for damages to the bar. He said, and then you get to helicopter pilots, and they don't have parties. So the level of stress goes up throughout. And really, it's true, because pilots have to be able to compartmentalize. And that's what he was using to predict stress. Said, fly my plane is the compartment in the middle. It's the last one to go. So if you want to predict a safety problem from somebody, you have to look at the other compartments. Are they having family problems? Are they having stress problems in this area? Are they having problems in the regular part of their work? What's going on with this and this and this? He said, now, I've had a lot of guys ask me if thinking that it would be a good idea if their spouses saw this particular film. I want you to, before you ask that, consider whether you really want your wife to know that she lives only in a compartment of your life.
Mm-hmm. Oh. So you have your 20-odd years in the Navy, and then eventually you get downsized out. Where'd you go from there?
The only place that I ever cried when I left was Pearl Harbor. Every place was interesting, but that was the only place that mattered that much to me. And I wanted to try living in Hawaii. It's very expensive. It's not possible to do it on retired pay. Mm-hmm. So it's not even really possible to do it in any comfortable sense on retired pay plus working at some service job someplace, right. Like McDonald's or a bookstore or something. So I knew that I would have to have another income. I have a lot of friends that still live in Hawaii. So I went out and I stayed with one of them for 6 weeks and moved into an efficiency and applied for positions. And I had figured out that I had enough money that I could stay there for about 10 months. Mm-hmm. And if by then I did not have a job that paid enough that I could stay, that I had enough money left to ship my express shipment back to the mainland. I put everything else in storage in the D.C. area. I had my car and about 800 pounds of express stuff, clothes and records and books and whatever. And I managed that. I had applied for a civil service position in September, and I got there in July. And the position closed. They called me for an interview in December, told me in January that if I cleared, I had the job. I cleared in March and went to work for them in April. I had been working for the Census Bureau. That was census year. So I had a little extra income coming in. And I work in intelligence.
But now you do that as a civilian rather than...
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, how do you think your time in the service wound up affecting you sort of as a person, or how you view the world or deal with things?
It is very different. You have to learn to think in much wider terms, both geographically, issue-wise, in terms of and just in time zones. I mean, that's one thing being stationed in the Pacific does for you. If you can't think in time zones, you can't figure anything out, because you have to talk to DC in the morning, Japan in the
Right.
afternoon. We change very gradually. You notice at first that it changes what you eat, what you find acceptable. And then you notice that the things that you pay attention to are not, in the terms of the news, are not the same things that everybody else pays attention to at home. I cannot talk to my brother about anything but the family. I have no relationship to anything in local politics, and I still haven't really developed very much of one, although it's coming back after being in Hawaii since 2000. So over almost 8 years now. You pay attention to national elections, you pay attention to what your senator says, what your representative says in terms of international things, general national things in terms of domestic policy on tax. You don't pay attention to anything local, road systems, construction, whatever, if you're single. Now, if you're married, you tend to be able to take that skill set out and plug it back in a different location, because it's going to affect your children.
Right.
The stuff to do with the school systems and transportation and that kind of thing. You have different concerns, portability of skills for your spouse. What's a new area going to be like that way? So you're much more aware of the differences in between different geographic areas in terms of what the housing market looks like, in terms of what the job market looks like, especially the housing market, even if you're single. Some things to do with the transportation pattern, but not the transportation infrastructure usually. Costs. I had a guy I was talking to in Hawaii when I was stationed there. I said, so where do you want to go when you transfer, Ed? And he said, Norfolk. And I said, why do you want to go to Norfolk? He said, because of the 5 or 6 big places that I can be stationed as an intelligence officer, which is what he was. That's the only one where I can afford to buy a house, because all of the other places were high-cost areas. And he had a family, a couple of little kids. You pay attention to different things in the weather. I mean, you start looking at patterns that affect much farther out than local weather reporting is different than it was when I first went in. You do see things in the satellite patterns in the local area and regionally, and if you watch the Weather Channel, you see it. And it's become a skill that the civilian community also has, looking at weather in terms of travel. But you develop that really quickly in the military, moving around, having to check things like that. The availability, you get very inventive about being able to get things that you can't find wherever you are. I still have problems with that. For a long time, every once in a while I would just go absolutely bonkers, and I would call my sister and say, I need you to go to the grocery store and buy me 2 rings of bologna, freeze them solid for 2 weeks, call Federal Express, find out when the shipment goes out, deliver it to Federal Express in a box about an hour before the shipment is going to go out, so they pack in dry ice and send it to wherever I am, and it will unthaw just about the time it gets here. It's just like that silly episode of MASH where they went crazy trying to get some kind of food that they could only get in Chicago.
Like that,
Yes.
yeah.
You can figure out strange things like that eventually. Of course, if you're in aviation and you know somebody who's flying from one point to another, that helps, but I've never been able to take advantage of that particular thing. You learn flight patterns. You pick up the habit of having airline mileage accounts much earlier than most people do, so that you can do something with it. You have the time zone map in your head. I never have succeeded in telling anyone in my family learning what time it is where I am. And that also included when I was stationed in Virginia, both in Norfolk and at the Pentagon, and I was in the same time zone they were. They still could not remember that it was the same time where I was and where they were. My cousin would call me, "What time is it?" 3 o'clock in the morning, Charlie. But yes, it does. And it changes your priorities, too, because you can see wider patterns internationally than most people who don't do a lot of traveling can see. So you worry about different things.
All right. Well, it makes for a pretty remarkable story, and thank you for taking the time to tell it to us.
Thank you.